be looking at Scripture, what it is, why it's important to us, and how it came down to us in English in the form that we know it today. So let's start with a definition of inspiration. Why inspiration? Because inspiration is the concept that differentiates Scripture from other literature. I've got a quote here from the dictionary, the New International Dictionary of the Christian Church. Inspiration as a spiritual phenomenon is not common to all believers, but is divinely reserved for specially authorized and authoritative bearers of God's message. This does not, however, imply that the message transmitted by chosen prophets and apostles is a product of mechanical divine dictation. Neo-Protestant theologians have long endeavoured within the Bible itself to distinguish inspired from supposedly uninspired strata. But such efforts turn serious biblical study into a shambles. Without the reliability of Bible history, scriptural theology cannot be credited, since the two are intertwined. And this basically tells us the Scripture is a message divinely inspired by God. We don't know precisely how the scribes were directed, but we do know from the nature of Scripture itself that they were not robots. They were free to use their own language, their own vocabulary, and even their own worldview. Scripture then is literature divinely inspired by God, and this differentiates it from every other form of literature that we know today. The nature of inspiration remains unclear to us because Scripture doesn't provide any specific details. But from the clues we have in Scripture, we do know that inspiration is full, not partial. It involved guidance, not dictation. It was a process over time, not a single event. And we know that the originals were inspired, not subsequent translations. There's no such thing as an inspired translation of the Bible. We also know that inspiration was intimate, personal, and miraculous. We know that it involved divine revelation in human language reflecting a contemporary worldview. And that's actually quite a lot to know about inspiration. And for the purposes of studying Scripture and learning about it and learning its message, that is really all we need to know. Any more precise details are simply not required. Brother Roberts describes Scripture in this way in Christendom Astray. He says, as a revelation to human beings, it is a revelation in human language. It is not a revelation of words, but of ideas, and hence everything in its language is subordinated to the purpose of imparting the ideas. The peculiarities of human speech are conformed to in the various particulars already mentioned. In other words, it's God's message in human speech. So let's look at the books that we know as the Old Testament. The Jews divide them into three main categories: the law, the prophets, and the writings. The law, of course, being the law of Moses, the prophets being the major and minor prophets, and the writings, everything else. But there are other books as well that are alluded to in Scripture that we don't actually have available today. We find Scripture telling us to look at the books of the Wars of the Lord, the book of the Acts of Solomon, the book of Shemaiah, the book of Jasher, the book of Jehu, the book of Nathan the prophet, the prophecy of Ahijah, the book of Samuel the seer, the book of Gad the seer, the visions of Iddo the seer, and the sayings of the seers. At various points throughout Kings and Chronicles, and I think also Samuel, the inspired writers tell us to look to these books for additional information on a subject they're discussing or a history that they've just summarized. And this tells us that those books were not only available in those days, but widely known. People could easily access them. We don't know what status these books held within the scope of inspired Scripture. We don't know if they were inspired or if only some of them were inspired. All we know is that they were not preserved for whatever reason, and that the Jews never saw necessary to keep them. In fact, by as early as the initial diaspora, it seems, a lot of these books were already missing and were no longer available. And certainly, I don't think there's any reference to them by the 1st century AD. The Jews themselves had lost these books entirely. But we do know then that Scripture does make reference to other literature that we don't know about, that we only have references to, but that these books were useful to the people who wrote Scripture and the people who read it originally to fill in the blanks about what else was recorded. We also have a range of books known as the Jewish Apocrypha. That's a number of books that were produced after the point at which the Jews concluded that inspiration had ceased. And Josephus, writing in the 1st century AD, says, "From Artaxerxes to our own time, the complete history has been written, but has not been deemed worthy of equal credit with the earlier records because of the failure of the exact succession of the prophets." So he's referring to books like the Book of Maccabees 1 and 2, the Book of Bel and the Dragon and Tobit, and all those other apocryphal works that we might find in the Catholic Bible, but not in our own. The Jews had concluded, as Josephus says, that these books, although useful and with historical merit, were not inspired and therefore could not be counted as part of Scripture. And this tells us that by the time the last book had been written, Malachi, the canon, that is the collection of inspired works, was considered closed. The Jews did not believe Scripture could be added to. It was around this time as well that the Septuagint was written. I've got a definition here or a description of the Septuagint from the Pocket Dictionary of Biblical Studies. This Greek translation was undertaken by the Greek-speaking Jews in Alexandria from the 3rd to 2nd century BC. The Septuagint is paramount for biblical scholars, both as a witness to the Hebrew text at that time and for an understanding of how certain words and texts were understood during the Second Temple period. So this period is, the Second Temple period is fairly broad. It covers the period just before Jesus and the period involving Jesus' life. Why did the Jews need to produce a Greek version of Hebrew scriptures? Because they spoke Greek. They're in Alexandria. They had been spread out by the diaspora into many different countries, and a large proportion of them had ended up in Alexandria, where Greek was the first language. So they needed a version of Scripture that could be understood by Jews to whom Greek was the first language. So they went through and they found the best copies available of the Hebrew, and they translated it into Greek. And the word Septuagint means 70, and that comes from an old Jewish tradition which states that the translation was conducted by 70 scholars who all acted individually, and when their translations were compared, it found that they were all perfectly the same. That's a nice little tradition. We know it can't possibly be true, but the name has stuck, so Septuagint it is. It also tells us, though, as the Pocket Dictionary of Biblical Studies points out, it gives us some insight into the way the Jews understood the Scriptures. Take, for example, the prophecy concerning the conception of the Messiah. What does Isaiah say about the conception? A virgin shall conceive. Now, in the Hebrew, the word is actually, I think it's Alma, which simply means a young woman. And within the context, of course, we can understand that to mean a virgin. But the Septuagint is very specific. It says Parthenos, which does actually mean virgin. That's very useful because it tells us that even before the Christian period, the Jews themselves understood this as a reference to a miraculous conception. And that is how Matthew, of course, translates it when he recites the same verse in his own gospel. So let's look at the process of the Jewish canon and its formation. We know that the Tanakh was completed, that is, that the Old Testament was completed by around 300 BC. The canon was considered closed by 200 BC because prophets were no more and inspiration had ended. By 132 BC, the Septuagint translation was complete, and in AD 98, Josephus lists the full canon of the Jewish scriptures, and it's exactly the same as the one that we use today. About 2,000 years later, of course, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, which gave us the earliest available manuscripts, much, much closer to the originals than we'd ever had before. I have a quote here from the Lexham Bible Dictionary. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the Judean desert has in many ways revolutionized the study of the Jewish scriptures, as well as recent understanding of the Bible and canon. The scrolls offer insight into the period when the Bible was coming into being in its present form. As such, the Dead Sea Scrolls have been called the greatest finds ever in biblical archaeology. The Dead Sea Scrolls were composed somewhere between 300 BC and AD 68. This puts us almost within living memory of the last originals that were written. It pushes back the age of the oldest scriptures available by about 800 odd years. Up until this point, I don't think we had anything earlier than around the 9th century AD. Nothing older than that. But now we have these amazing scrolls, literally dozens, hundreds of them, that allow us to see a version of the scripture which is so much older than we've ever seen before. And we can also see in that the consistency of scripture as it has come down to us today. Now let's turn to the New Testament. The New Testament consists of the Gospels, which is the story of Jesus, Acts, which is the story of Jesus' apostles and the rise of the church, the epistles, which is basically other people's mail, and then the Apocalypse, which is the revelation of John. And these four groupings fit together very well. There's a certain interrelationship between them that gives us some confidence that they were all composed within the same century. They make reference to each other to some extent, they interweave, and they complement each other. But just like the Jewish Apocrypha, there were other Christian writings that sprang up in the post-apostolic period. There's the Shepherd of Hermas, the Gospel of the Egyptians. Someone decided they needed one as well for some reason. The Second Clement, which was a spurious addition to First Clement, which was a legitimate piece of writing by a first century Christian. The Gospel of Basilides, the Apocalypse of Peter, the Acts of Andrew. If you want to know what Andrew got up to, well, you won't find them in the Acts of Andrew, but you might want to have a look at it anyway. Then there's the traditions of Matthias and the Gospel of Thomas and a whole bunch of others. And we know that these do not fit into the New Testament canon. They're written too late. Their theology is wrong. Their language is wrong. They're not written in the right area by the right people. They're too diverse in their ideas. They don't agree with each other. They're often self-contradictory. They spring up in odd little pockets where the gospel was only partially understood and the Christian message had already either been corrupted or was simply in the process of evolving into something new. Modern biblical scholars, even non-Christian scholars, will agree that these books have no place in the New Testament canon. They just don't have the provenance. They don't meet the same standards of evidence that the 27 books of the canon do. So let's look at that canon. We know that between AD 30 to AD 40, the primary mode of transmission of the gospel and the Christian message was oral. People talked to each other about what they'd seen and heard and learned from Jesus and his followers. Between AD 40 and AD 60, the first documents were written. Mark, for example, the first gospel, and around the 50s, the epistles of Paul. By AD 170, Christians pretty much universally agreed that all four gospels were inspired, and by AD 200, 23 of the 27 books were universally accepted. It took time, of course, because these scriptures were not always available to everyone. It took quite a while for them to filter out across the empire to different people, and even in a complete form, or even to people who could actually read them at all. So it's not until AD 367 that we have a broader consensus that the 27 books of the New Testament should be accepted as scripture. Between AD 382 and 384, a guy called Jerome translates the Bible into Latin, and that's the Latin Vulgate we know today, and he uses the same Old Testament and New Testament canons that we use today. And by AD 397, Christians universally agreed that the canon was closed. Nothing more could be added to it. For the most part, these decisions were made by individuals, local authorities, say Athanasius of Alexandria in AD 367, and local councils by small groups of churches who had a collection of books and decided that these were authoritative. There was no universal authority at that time to tell everyone this is the set of books that we agree on. It was a far more organic process. But certainly, as I've already said, biblical scholars have vindicated the decision of the church to accept these 27 books as inspired, because no other writings can match the same standard of evidence that they do. So let's look at the process of translating scripture into English. It doesn't start with Stephen Langton, but he's a good place to start because he was the Archbishop of Canterbury, and he's the one who added chapter divisions to the Bible. He added them to the Latin Vulgate, which made the Bible a lot easier to reference when discussing it with other people or when studying it. And his arrangement of chapters became the standard for all subsequent Bibles. So all Bibles from that point used the chapter divisions introduced by Stephen Langton. At that point, though, no one thought to put in verses. So I don't know how helpful that was. I suppose it was broadly helpful, but you couldn't quote scripture quite as accurately as you can today. John Wycliffe, 1320 to 1384, he initiated and led the translation of the New Testament from the Latin Vulgate into English. This was a revolutionary move done at a time when the church did not like the idea of common people having access to scripture in their own language. It was widely believed by the church that scripture should be left in the hands of the clergy, and that in a language that only the clergy could read. Of course, it was quite convenient that most people couldn't read even in their own language, but the church wasn't taking any chances, and with a greater interest in scripture by scholars like Wycliffe and others, they wanted to guard the reading of scripture very closely. And why was that important? Because to read scripture is to interpret it. It's almost impossible to read scripture without interpreting it in some way. Oh, sure, plenty of passages of scripture very easily understood at face value. But what do we do when we come across verses we disagree on? The church did not like the idea of people disagreeing on verses. The church had already decided what these verses meant. And the church knew that to read scripture is to interpret it. So in order to prevent people coming to alternative interpretations, they must be prevented from reading it. John Wycliffe did not take this view and decided that scripture should be translated into English, so he did that with the New Testament, and the church hated him for it, but he was protected by a powerful patron called John of Gaunt, who made sure that no harm came to him. However, after Wycliffe died, the church dug him up and burned his bones and threw them in the river. Pretty petty. 1460 to 1524, that's Thomas Linacre. Linacre was a renowned scholar. He was fluent in Latin, but particularly noted for his exceptional mastery of Greek. And he was the teacher of Desiderius Erasmus, who was a Dutch Reformed scholar, a Dutch scholar of the Reformed period, who produced a Greek New Testament of his own. And Linacre found, when he was going through the Latin Vulgate, that there were many errors. He found that it did not match up very well with the Greek manuscripts available to him in many places. So he corrected it when making his own Greek translation. And upon reading the Gospels in Greek for the very first time, he declared, either this is not the Gospel or we are not Christians. Desiderius Erasmus, 1466 to 1536, he was a classical scholar of the Renaissance and Reformation eras, a Dutch scholar who produced a definitive Greek text, what was called a critical text of the New Testament. And he did this by collecting all the best manuscripts available to him at the time and ironing them all out so that he had one Greek New Testament patched together from different manuscripts. And the idea was good and he went about it the right way, but he was very rushed by the desire to be the first to get his work published. So he pushed it into print as soon as possible, and unfortunately hundreds of errors were left in it. It was still very good. It was arguably the best for its time, but it has not stood the test of time, and subsequent scholars came to realise its weaknesses. He didn't even have a full text of the Greek New Testament either. He had to copy-paste a few bits and pieces in from Latin, which means that parts of it are quite inconsistent. Miles Coverdale, 1488 to 1568. He produced the first complete printed translation of the Bible into English. And then William Tyndale, 1494 to 1536. Probably hardly need to introduce him. He is famous for producing the first English Bible translated directly from Hebrew and Greek. He didn't touch any Latin manuscripts. He was fluent in Hebrew. He was fluent in Greek. He wanted to translate the Bible directly from its original languages, and that's what he did. And as a result of this and some theological views that he held, which were not wildly favourable, such as his rejection of the idea of the immortality of the soul, and his rejection of the idea that we go to heaven and hell when we die, Tyndale had a copy of his book tied to his arm, and he was burned to death at the stake on charges of heresy. However, it was too late to put that genie back in the bottle, because Tyndale's Bible was massively influential, and his Bible provided the foundation for all subsequent English Bibles, up to and including the King James Version. A lot of subsequent translators decided it was much easier to copy-paste from Tyndale's work than to do all the legwork themselves. And the KJV, for example, 30% of the King James Version is lifted straight from Tyndale, with some minor vocabulary changes. John Rogers, 1500 to 1555, he produced the first English commentary on the Bible, and later translators drew on his work. He was also the first English Protestant martyr executed by Bloody Mary, the Catholic Queen of Scots. Robert Estienne, 1503 to 1559, he was a former Catholic who turned Protestant, and he's the one who added numbered verses to the biblical text. And his arrangement became the standard for all subsequent Bibles. So we've got the chapter divisions of Stephen Langton and the verse divisions of Robert Estienne, and it's been the same ever since in every Bible. The Great Bible was published in 1539. It was an authorized Bible, if you like, approved by the monarch. Then there was the Geneva Bible, 1568, produced in Europe by the Reformed Church, largely produced by the Puritans. This was the most influential Bible of its time. It was pretty much the King James Version of its day, and it was the most complete Bible available. It had maps, it had notes, it had cross-references. It was an extremely useful Bible, very very rich in the work that had gone into it and in the quality of the translation. However, the footnotes contained theology. They contained interpretations of verses from a Protestant perspective, specifically from a Reformed Puritan perspective. That angered the Catholics, and it also angered the Anglicans, neither of whom liked the Protestants at all. Particularly contentious for the Anglicans was the fact that the Geneva Bible undermined the idea that the king is the head of the church. The Anglicans had already decided that the king is the head of the church. And who had decided that? Well, none other than the founder of the church, which was King Henry. But the Geneva Bible was at pains to emphasize, wherever monarchs were represented or mentioned in Scripture, the Geneva Bible was at pains to mention, partly by its translation and by its references in the margin, that the king is subject to God and that he is not the head of the church. So the Anglicans did not like this idea, plus the fact that the Geneva Bible had certain passages translated in a way that were blatantly theological, reflecting Puritan doctrine. So the Anglicans decided they would have to do something about that. They produced the Bishop's Bible in 1568, which was intended as a pushback against the Geneva Bible. But it wasn't very good quality, and it was a bit rushed, and it wasn't very popular. So the Geneva Bible just steamrolled right over it. The Catholics, meanwhile, were working on their own Bibles. The Douay-Rheims Bible was produced in 1610, and that was an attempt to sort of push back against these English translations coming up from the Protestants and the Anglicans, and that, of course, reflected Catholic theology. And then came the King James Version. I've got a quote here from a book about the King James Version by a guy called Alistair McGrath, and the book is called In the Beginning, if you want to look it up. McGrath says, "There was no doubt what James wanted to achieve during his reign. A unified Protestant England, united around an agreed translation of the Bible. His new translation of the Bible would be a powerful factor in creating a cohesive English national identity, especially over and against Roman Catholicism. The production at the King's initiative of a new English translation of the Bible would reinforce the image of the king as the political and spiritual leader of his people." Now, McGrath refers there to Protestant England, which is a fairly loose language there, because, of course, James himself was Anglican, and he was producing an Anglican translation. But the Protestants were very strong in England at the time. James wanted a Bible that was at least going to be acceptable to everyone, so he needed to appease the Protestants as well as the Anglicans, but he specifically wanted to push back against the Catholics. So the King James Version had a number of interesting features. What style of language was it written in? What era of Elizabethan, pretty much, yes. It was not written in King James English. No one wanted to read a Bible in King James English. Why? Because they'd been reading the Geneva Bible for decades, and they loved the language of the Geneva Bible. That was one of its greatest selling points. So King James said to the translators, "Do not use contemporary English. Copy the Geneva English. Use language that is already outdated." So we've got a whole string of words and terms and phrases and idioms in the King James Bible that were already obsolete in 1611. People weren't even using anymore, but they were kept in there because it was a great way to gain market share. Copy the market leader, the Geneva Bible. So people looked at the King James Bible and go, "Oh, okay, yeah, sounds like the Geneva Bible. This is quite good. Let's keep reading." The King James Version, of course, introduces very Anglican language, like the word bishops, where Tyndale had used the word shepherds, and it pushes the idea that the idea that the bishops are, of course, higher than other members of the church. There's just simply subtle references to it in the way that it's been translated. So King James knew that by using the word bishops, which now has a very well-established meaning within the context of the church, that's what people are going to think of when they read that word in the New Testament. It's very anachronistic, but it will work that way. James also made sure that none of those naughty Puritan ideas were in the text anywhere to be found, either by translation or by cross-references or marginal references. He gave strict instructions that all marginal references should only be for the purpose of cross-referencing to another passage or providing a simple alternative translation of a word or two here and there. They were not allowed to insert theology into the footnotes, because that was the big main problem with the Geneva Bible. So the King James Version is produced, reflecting Anglican theology, pushing back against the Puritans, mainly pushing back against the Catholics, and also giving the very strong impression that the king is the only one with the authority to do this because he is the head of the church. The King James Version was not very successful against the Geneva Bible initially. The Geneva Bible had decades of market share under its belt, but gradually over the next 10, 20 years, the King James Version gained traction. The language of it was very beautiful. It wasn't quite the language of Shakespeare, but it was sufficiently flowery and eloquent to make people feel that it was very similar, and it became the dominant translation over time, particularly as the Anglicans managed to push the Puritans out. Where did the Puritans end up going? United States. Yep, they all went to America. So the Puritans started to be persecuted, of course, by the Anglicans. So they fled to the USA to avoid persecution by the Anglicans, and as soon as they got there, they started persecuting the Quakers. So let's have a quick look at the way the English translation of the Bible has evolved. I'm not even going to attempt to read out all of this here, but you can see just from looking at Psalm 23, from Old English through early Middle English to Middle English to early Modern English, all of a sudden, early Modern English looks very modern indeed. And the early Modern English there that we have, that actually reflects the way the King James Version originally looked. It was initially translated in 1611, but the version we use today is not the 1611 version. We use a version that was created around, I think it was the 1700s by Oxford and Cambridge. So we're not actually using the original King James, the original language that the King James was translated into. We're looking at a much later version of early modern English. Let's look now at a concept called textual criticism. This is an important idea to get our heads around because it speaks directly to the way we determine the authority of Scripture, the accuracy of Scripture, and how we can know it is accurate. I've got a quote here from the Pocket Dictionary for the Study of New Testament Greek. The study of the manuscript evidence for a written... textual criticism is the study of the manuscript evidence for a written work of which the original is no longer extant, is no longer available, with the intent to discern the original text. Textual criticism involves gathering and organising data, evaluating variant readings, reconstructing the history of the transmission of the text, and attempting to identify the original text. So basically, textual criticism is the process of gathering up all the different copies, all the different manuscripts, comparing them, trying to work out which is the oldest, which is the most reliable, which is the most accurate, and then piecing together a final product that we believe most accurately represents the original. And this is the process that started all the way back in the 3rd century, believe it or not. Does anyone know who was the first textual critic in history? He was in Alexandria. It was a guy called Origen of Alexandria. And he lived during a time of persecution, which makes his work even more impressive. and he produced the first interlinear Bible. He got different versions of the Old Testament. He got them in Hebrew, original Hebrew texts. He had a couple of versions of the Septuagint. He also had the Hebrew text in Greek letters. And he produced an interlinear Bible, an interlinear Old Testament, with all of those different variants reflected so that you could compare them side by side and determine which one was the most accurate. Origen is the first textual critic we know of. He invented the interlinear Bible, and he produced about 6,000 works over his lifetime. Unfortunately, most of those were subsequently destroyed by the church because he came up with some ideas that they didn't like universalism, the idea that everyone's eventually going to be saved. In fact, Origen taught that even the devil would be saved one day, and people did not like that idea at all. So they destroyed most of his work, which is a crying shame because a great deal of valuable work must have been lost. But he produced this interlinear translation known as the Hexaplar, and modern scholars are actually in the process of reconstructing it today. So at some point soon we will have a complete version of Origen's Hexaplar, the world's first interlinear Bible. So he had the right idea, but it was too a long time but before that process sort of got refined further and became more useful and had some application to the English text. Now let's look at some popular criticisms of the Bible by people who don't believe it's inspired. People say, for example, the Gospels were written too late. They can't possibly be an accurate reflection of what Jesus did or taught. They can't have been written by people who knew him. They were written far too late. We can't even take them seriously as biographies, let alone anything inspired. So let's compare the Gospels to other biographies from the ancient world. This chart shows the number of years between the death of the person who was written about and the earliest biography that was written about him. Pontius Pilate there, we have a very close distance, only 10 years between his death and the first biography. Hannibal Barca, who attacked Rome through the Alps on elephants, of all things, 17 years. Jesus, 20 years. We know that the first gospel is circulating just 20 years after his ascension. The Emperor Hadrian, 90 years. Simon Bar Kokhba, 95. Rabbi Hillel, 213. Alexander the Great, 273 years. Now, none of these other people are considered unhistorical or mythical. They're all accepted as historical people, and their biographies are accepted again as highly accurate. So there is no valid basis for claiming that Jesus' biographies, the Gospels, were written far too late. They simply weren't. We do have evidence that the earliest Gospels were written all the way back in the 1st century, that Mark is written somewhere around the 50s. The Gospels were definitely not written too late. They were written within living memory of the person they were written about. So you can't criticise the Gospels on that point. So how old then are the earliest available copies of the New Testament documents? Because that's another argument. The only available copies are from far too long ago. We don't know what alterations might have occurred between then and now. Well, this chart shows the number of years between the original manuscripts and the oldest existing copies. And here the New Testament simply beats everyone. New Testament, 40 years between the original manuscripts and the oldest existing copies. And that's largely thanks to the existence of the Rylands fragment, which is a tiny piece of John that's variously dated to either the absolute end of the 1st century or the early 2nd century. That puts us within striking distance, within living memory of John himself. And then we can compare this to other copies of other ancient writings, the works of Sophocles, 200 years, Homer, 400, Livy, 400, Tacitus, 750, Julius Caesar, 950, Demosthenes, 1,100, Plato, 1,300, and Aristotle, 1,400 years between his original writings and the oldest copies of his work still existing today. So measured by this metric, again, the New Testament absolutely canes all other competition. We can't use that argument against the Bible. It simply does not stack up. It's not a valid argument, and it is certainly not an argument that modern biblical scholars, textual scholars, even non-Christian scholars would accept. They would say, no, that is simply ridiculous. So how many manuscripts have survived? Because that's another argument. Well, in this chart, longer is better because it shows that we have many more surviving copies of New Testament manuscripts than any other ancient text. And this indicates a tradition of overwhelmingly reliable textual transmission. It shows that people copy these manuscripts regularly, frequently, carefully, and by comparing them, we can see the consistency of those copies. So we have about 10,000 New Testament manuscripts in Latin from various centuries. We have 5,000 New Testament manuscripts in Greek, 1,757 for Homer, 340 for Demosthenes, 241 for Caesar, 210 for Plato, 193 for Sophocles, 150 for Livy, 49 for Aristotle, and only 30 for Tacitus. Now, nobody goes around arguing that the works of these other men are incomplete or poorly transcribed or should be discarded because we don't have enough manuscripts to get an accurate enough view of what they actually said in the originals. They are universally accepted as accurate. So again, textual scholars will tell you, you can't use that argument against the Bible. You can't say we don't have enough manuscripts to piece together an accurate picture of the original text. The New Testament beats any other ancient manuscript of its era. Now, there are two main groups of Greek manuscripts that have come down to us. One group is called the majority text because there's more of them, and they are associated with the Byzantine Empire. That was the Eastern Empire, the eastern wing of the Roman Empire, which continued on for many centuries after the Western Roman section had fallen. And the Byzantine Empire was largely Greek influenced. And the texts that we have from that period are much younger. That is to say, they were copied down much, much later. We do have many more of them than the older manuscripts, but they're not always so reliable. Then we have what's known as the Alexandrian text, or the neutral text. Here we have fewer manuscripts from this collection, but they are much, much older. They are much closer to the originals, and they are widely used to correct errors that we know to exist in the majority text. And by using the evidence from both groupings of those manuscripts, we can sift through them and arrive at the most accurate picture of the original New Testament books. And then that's what we call a critical text, as I referred to earlier. A critical text, quoting from the Pocket Dictionary of Biblical Studies, is a printed biblical text that does not reflect any single ancient document, but rather is a conjectural reconstruction and the product of textual criticism. It is a text formed by comparing the numerous variations of the manuscripts and including what is considered to be the superior reading of each variation. And in the 19th century, which is again when this critical text was produced, the Variorum New Testament, in fact that's an original 1881 Variorum New Testament that I've actually got on my bookshelf. In the late 1900s, that's from 1880. In 1881, the following year, a new work started to be done, and two scholars called Westcott and Hort produced another critical text which was superior to that, drawing on additional manuscripts and new methods of study. And Westcott and Hort summarised their rules for textual criticism, which I've managed to compress into two basic categories. External criteria, that is, manuscripts are to be weighed, not counted. That is, it doesn't matter how many copies we've got. What matters is the quality of those copies and how old they are. And secondly, internal criteria. The best reading is the one that best explains the others. So if we have a verse in a particular chapter that appears in different forms, we have to look very carefully and compare them. Ask ourselves why those different forms might exist. Do they reflect later ideas, for example? Do we have a verse here that in a later version suggests that Jesus is God, whereas the older version is very explicit that Jesus is a human being? That's very clear. That's evidence of theological shift. We can see that the later reading, the later translation, has been produced as a product of later theology. That means our earlier reading is likely to be more reliable. So we compare different readings and ask ourselves why one reading might have emerged over another, and by that way we can arrive at the most likely, the most accurate reflection of the text. Modern scholars will agree that the modern New Testament is both accurate and reliable. I've got a quote here from Marcus Borg's book, The Gospels Are Reliable as Memory and Testimony. Sorry, not his book, it's an article. Now, Marcus Borg was a very liberal Christian, but he had absolutely no doubt that the modern New Testament was pretty much unimpeachable in terms of its accuracy and quality. He says, centuries of textual criticism, the careful comparison and analysis of ancient manuscripts of the Gospels have resulted in a text accepted by a consensus of scholarship, both conservative and mainstream. With only a few minor exceptions, we can be confident that the Gospels and the New Testament we can accept the Gospels and the New Testament as a wholly reliable report of what was originally written. I'm going to close with two ideas. Firstly, that Scripture is aware of its audience. This is a principle that tells us that Scripture was produced not just for the people who originally read it, but for the benefit of people who would read it a long time later in different places, in different lands, in different languages. We know this because Scripture explains itself to a different audience where necessary. Look at Ruth 4 verse 7 here. Now this used to be the customary way to finalize a transaction involving redemption in Israel. A man would remove his sandal and give it to the other party. Why does it say that? Because it's writing for the benefit of a later audience at a time when this custom is no longer practiced. 1 Samuel 9 verse 9. This explains a title that was no longer in use for the benefit of a later audience. Now, it used to be in Israel that whenever someone went to inquire of God, he would say, "Come on, let's go to the seer." For today's prophet used to be called a seer. And again, John 1 verse 42, Andrew brought Simon to Jesus. Jesus looked at him and said, "You are Simon, the son of John. You will be called Cephas," which is translated Peter. And here, John explains the meaning of an Aramaic name for the benefit of an audience that is not familiar with Aramaic. Scripture then is aware of its immediate audience, and it's aware that there is a future audience. Scripture looks beyond itself and is accommodating not only to the people who originally read it, but for those who read it in subsequent centuries, all the way up to our own time. And this is a remarkable, insightful provision. And finally, Scripture is aware of itself. This is a chart that was produced by a handful of Christians, and it shows a visualization of 63,779 biblical cross-references. Now, the vertical lines going down that way are all books, and the length of the line denotes the length of the book. That's why we've got that massive one in the middle, which is Psalms, most of which, of course, is Psalm 119. And the cross-references show how the New Testament and the Old Testament are deeply interrelated. They reference each other, they quote each other, they weave back and forth. The message of God and his purpose with us and with his Son is consistent from Genesis to Revelation. It's woven in and out. From a theological perspective, we can have confidence that Scripture is aware of itself. Across the thousands of years during which it was produced, Scripture was not broken. Scripture was maintained, translated properly, and it has come down to us in a form that is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, and for instruction in righteousness.